Now, in my view, every photographer should have at least one prime lens in their camera bag. Want to know why? Stick around, I'll tell you. Hi, Paul here from Photogenius. Now this video is all about prime lenses. This is not the first video I've made on this subject. It certainly won't be the last because literally on a daily basis I get asked about prime lenses. What are the benefits of prime lenses? What prime lenses do I recommend? Well, in this video I want to address some of these questions. I want to give you some answers. I also want to recommend some prime lenses to you guys, and don't forget to stick around to the end of the video for a bonus tip. So what is a prime lens? Well, a prime lens is a lens that has a fixed focal length. Here I have the Canon 50mm prime lens, often referred to as the Nifty 50. Here I have the Canon 18 to 55mm kit lens. You may have the same lens, very popular. And with this lens, I can set the focal length to 18mm, and that gives me a nice wide view. But if I want to zoom into my subject, I can adjust the focal length to 55mm, and that makes my subject appear much closer. Now with the prime lens, there is no zoom. It's fixed at 50mm in the case of this lens, and this simply means if I want to get closer to my subject, I simply move closer to my subject. If I want a wider view, I take a few steps backwards. So effectively, when using a prime lens, your feet become your zoom. Now what the prime lens may lack in terms of zoom, it more than makes up for in terms of aperture, because generally with prime lenses, the aperture will open up much wider than with zoom lenses. For example, back to the 18 to 55mm lens, maximum aperture with this lens at 18mm is f3.5. But if you zoom into 55mm, the aperture now drops, so it isn't as big, f5.6. Now with the 50mm prime lens, this particular one has a maximum aperture of f1.8, and that is significantly wide. So we've learned so far with a prime lens we don't have the ability to zoom in or out, but compared to zoom lenses we have a much wider aperture. So how does this affect our photography, and what, if any, are the benefits? So let's talk about aperture. Having the ability to open the aperture as wide as f1.8 is great for a number of reasons. Firstly, the lower the f number, the wider the aperture, the more shallow the depth of field will be in your image. Now, depth of field is photography talk for blurry foregrounds and backgrounds. I love photos like these where the subject really stands out because the foreground and the background are blurry, so there are no distractions. Now what's interesting is when you look at a picture, your eye will naturally be drawn towards what is sharp, not what is blurry. Now photographers use this as a technique to draw the eye of the viewer to the subject. Now this is a technique often used by portrait photographers, so prime lenses are often called portrait lenses. Not entirely the right term, but you get the idea. Now another bonus of having a wide aperture is this. With the aperture wide open, we're allowing more light to pass down the lens into the camera. This means we can then use a much faster shutter speed, which helps us eliminate and reduce camera shake. Camera shake is a problem when you're hand holding the camera and the shutter speed's very slow. But with the aperture wide open, because we're getting so much light down the lens, we can use a much faster shutter speed, even when you're shooting in poor light. This photo, for example, was taken in the evening. Because the aperture was wide open, I got more light down the lens, I could bump the shutter speed up a little bit and still take the photo without having to rely on a tripod. Sometimes prime lenses are referred to as fast lenses. Now this is an interesting term because in reality there's nothing particularly fast about a prime lens. It's simply that the larger aperture allows us to use a faster shutter speed. Now with more light passing through the lens, we can also reduce the camera's ISO. The benefits of this are the lower the ISO, the less likely we're going to see digital noise spoiling our image. ISO 200 is generally my default ISO setting, and if you're not familiar with ISO, I've done a separate video on this subject. I'll put a link in the description below the video. Now let's talk about image quality. The problem with zoom lenses are this: they are quite complicated things. They need to cover a wide focal range, and this means there's a lot more moving parts, and this can cause issues. And generally it's accepted that with a zoom lens, they're not sharp throughout the whole focal range. Now with prime lenses, however, there's less moving parts, simply because a prime lens just has to be really good at one thing and one thing only. That can often mean sharper images with less distortion compared to the same focal length on a zoom lens. Now let's talk about the lack of zoom. If up until now you've only ever used a zoom lens, then you will find that when you use a prime lens it does take some getting used to, and that's because your feet become your zoom. Now I think this is a good thing. Zoom lenses can make us lazy photographers because we don't have to do as much work. We can stand still and let the zoom do the work for us. But when we put a prime lens on, we find that we have to walk around a little bit. So you might be walking closer to your subject, you might be walking further away from your subject. And again, I think this is a good thing because I honestly believe that it will get you thinking a bit more about your composition. And composition can really make or break an image. So just to recap, 5 good reasons for buying a prime lens. Number 1, blurry backgrounds. Remember, the term for this is a shallow depth of field. If you like blurry backgrounds, blurry foregrounds, but a nice sharp subject, then a prime lens may be worth picking up. Number 2, faster shutter speed. If you're doing handheld photography, the faster the shutter speed, the less likely you're going to get camera shake. Number 3, lower ISO. With the prime lens and the wide aperture, you can reduce the ISO. This means you're less likely to get digital noise spoiling your photo. Number 4, prime lenses generally perform really well in low light, again because the wider aperture is allowing more light down the lens. And number 5, because you haven't got a zoom, you're forced into using your feet to move around your subject, and I really think this will improve your composition. Now, before I share with you my bonus tip, I want to recommend to you 5 great prime lenses for Canon and Nikon DSLR cameras. So let's start with the Canon 50mm f1.8 prime lens, also known as the Nifty 50. This lens never leaves my camera bag and is great value for money. Nikon also make a 50mm f1.8 prime lens, not quite as good value for money as the Canon. 2 versions available. I recommend the G as the autofocus will work on all of the Nikon cameras. Next up is the Nikon 35mm f1.8 lens. I use this lens a lot and have pretty much worn mine out, so I'll be buying a new one soon. I like the 35mm focal length because it's a bit wider than the 50. Now, if you can afford to blow the budget, the Sigma 35mm f1.4 prime lens is amazing. It's not cheap, but it's a great lens, and they make versions available for Nikon, Canon, Sigma and Pentax cameras. Now, if you're looking for a prime lens on a budget, then check out this Chinese-made Nifty 50 from Yongnuo. I recently tested this. I made a video all about it. It didn't perform very well against the Canon equivalent, but it is the cheapest prime you can buy. So if you're looking for a prime lens and you haven't got a lot of money to spend, then this may be worth checking out. For more information on any of those lenses, check out the link in the description below the video. Now, bonus tip time. I want to talk about lens hoods. I have a couple of lens hoods here. This one is for the 50mm prime lens, and this one fits the 18 to 55mm kit lens. Now, these lens hoods did not come with these lenses. Sadly, they are an accessory that you have to purchase, but these are well worth picking up for a number of reasons. It fits on the lens like so, and the main reason for buying one of these is the lens hood will help to reduce lens flare and unwanted light from spoiling your photo. Number 2, with a lens hood, you're likely to see better contrast within your image and more saturated, richer colors. And number 3, not what they're intended for, but a lens hood is also another great way of protecting the glass on your lens. When you're not using a lens hood, you can remove it and put it on backwards, so that way it takes up less space in your camera bag. And as you can see, lens hoods come in different shapes and sizes, and they are lens specific, so make sure you buy the right hood for your lens. So I hope you've picked up some great tips on using prime lenses as well as lens hoods. If you've enjoyed the video, give us a thumbs up, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget you can leave your comments, questions, suggestions down below. I hope to see you again soon. See ya, bye.